it's about a year to the next presidential elections in Ukraine. Although they were held in May 2014, the legal end of Poroshenko's term is the last day of March of next year. So the date hasn't been set yet, but it's probably going to be around there, or maybe April of 2019. It's difficult, therefore, to believe that opinion polls today will be exactly correct as to what will transpire in a year's time. A year in Ukrainian and year in anybody's politics is a long time. Anything could happen in the next year. It's also unusual that the sitting president, the incumbent, doesn't go through to the second round. Ukraine's had, if I'm not mistaken, 5 presidential elections since 1991, and only on one occasion or 2 occasions has the election campaign been one where the sitting president has not gone through to the second round, and that was in 2010 when Viktor Yushchenko came in 5th in the first round and didn't go through to the second round. But back in 1994, for example, Leonid Kravchuk, who was then the candidate of Western Central Ukraine, did go through to the second round. So it's very likely, in my view, that Petro Poroshenko will be in the second round. And therefore, opinion polls which are floating around today that show him not likely to be in the second round, I think will be probably wrong. The other issue we should bear in mind is that there's a lot of speculation about maybe some new faces will turn up. Of course, Ukrainian voters would love to see new faces in Ukrainian politics. The most spoken about potential new face is the lead singer of Okyan Yelzi, Vakarchuk, but he's ruled out. At least what I've read, he's ruled out standing. I think he's right to do that. He's still young. He could stand in the next elections after this, and also he has a bit of a problem record, because he did stand for parliament once in 2007 when he was elected by Our Ukraine, but he didn't like the work of parliament and left after only 1 year. So he got out of the heat of the kitchen, as it were. Well, if he couldn't hack Ukrainian parliament back in 2007, how can he hack the post of the president during wartime in Ukraine? And so that will work against him. I mean, if I was recommending anything for him, I would say get elected to parliament, earn your spurs in parliament in an important committee, and then use that as a springboard to stand for Ukrainian president. And maybe in the 2024 elections, I would say. Then you probably might have a good chance. But at the moment, I don't think you will. Other new faces don't seem to be around. And it's probably too late now, with only a year to go, that any new faces will show up. So therefore, what do we have? Well, we have not a great bunch, to be honest, which is not the first time in Ukrainian politics. You've got basically Poroshenko against a bunch of populists. You've got, of course, the lead populist is Yulia Tymoshenko. Then you've got sort of a few pro-Russian ones like Yuriy Boyko, Vadim Rabinovich, and then this dark horse spoiler, Oleh Lyashko, who's a fake kind of radical nationalist funded by Ukrainian oligarchs to take votes away from Tymoshenko and Ukrainian nationalists. I mean, he's a complete fake. I mean, let's not pretend otherwise. So, I mean, various polls have shown Poroshenko facing either Tymoshenko or maybe somebody else. I somehow don't think it's going to be one of the pro-Russian candidates. I still think it's going to be Poroshenko versus Tymoshenko. So I think in that sense, the argument made by Poroshenko that he is the only one really stopping a kind of a populist revenge candidate coming to power is probably correct. Vox Ukraine, a very good NGO, in a kind of a think tank, have done incredible analyses of Ukrainian politicians, how they vote, if they vote for reforms, which reforms they support, how often they attend parliament, and have fact-checked their speeches. And in one recent post that Vox Ukraine did about which Ukrainian politicians are the biggest liars, biggest ones who tell untruths, the top 5 were Yulia Tymoshenko first, Rabinovich second, Boyko third, and then surprisingly, somebody from Samopomich, the Self-Reliance, the party headed by Lviv Mayor Sadovyi, and of course Lyashko. So the top 3 were Tymoshenko, Boyko, and Rabinovich. This is again not that surprising, because populists tend to sort of be very economical with the truth. Let's look at Donald Trump, for example. I mean, kind of quite divorced from reality most of the time, and that's certainly the case with these potential political leaders. It is more hurtful and surprising for politicians such as Tymoshenko or Samopomich than it is for the pro-Russian guys. I'm not surprised that they are sort of, lying pro-Russian populists, because, I mean, party regions was exactly the same, and they came from the party regions. But, political parties are supposedly pro-Western, supposedly taking Ukraine into Europe, supposedly the ones that want to Europeanize Ukraine. If they're acting as though they're just basically old Soviet-style politicians lying through their teeth all the time, well, that's a problem. The other problem that politicians like Tymoshenko have is that her and her faction, Batьківщина, Fatherland Party, traction on supporting reforms in Ukraine are actually quite poor. Again, Vox Ukraine has done this, some very good studies of what members of each faction support in terms of key reforms in Ukraine. And the key reforms are issues such as fighting corruption, decentralization, medical reform, pension reform, and banking reform. Those are like the 5 big ones. And they haven't got a good track record. Batьківщина, and in particular Tymoshenko, for example, has always been vocally and strongly opposed to land privatization and land reform. So she has a very kind of socialist view of the need to keep land in kind of government hands. And she actually is trying to organize a nationwide referendum in Ukraine against land reform, which is one of the requirements of the IMF, US, Canada, EU, by the way. And now land reform is also very closely tied to decentralization, which has been actually a very big success story in Ukraine. And these populists are not very big on supporting decentralization. Decentralization has been successful. Why? Because you've basically you're getting over the problem of removing the old Soviet system at the local level of, firstly, tight centralization, that all the budgetary money collected at the local level goes straight to the central government, and then the central government releases money for the local areas, and too many different administrative units. So what you've had now with decentralization is the kind of amalgamation of these different administrative units, greater allowance for them to keep hold of the budgetary receipts that they've collected, as opposed to sending it to Kiev and then getting something back. And so many of these so-called amalgamated communities, for the first time ever, have large budgets at their disposal, which they can use for local issues such as roads, schools, and elsewhere. So it's actually quite popular. And one of the success stories of reform in Ukraine, which very few people talk about. But that's very much tied to land privatization, land reform, which will create a market for land, and which populists don't particularly like. Tymoshenko has also been very critical of pension and medical reform, which again have been two demands of the West, IMF, EU and America, Canada, and which again have been long overdue and quite successful. The Ministry of Health is an American Ukrainian lady married to a Canadian Ukrainian, Marko Suprun, and she has been doing a remarkable job in cleaning up the corruption, particularly in the buying of medicines in the Ministry of Health. So again, I don't understand the criticism of these reforms in these other areas as well, which are being actually quite successful. So what do you have? You have, I think, in my view, my prediction would be that it would go to a Poroshenko versus Tymoshenko second round. It's very rare that the presidential elections are won in the first round. It only happened twice, in 1991 and 2014, when Kravchuk and Poroshenko won in the first round. It's probably likely to go through to the second round. I don't think the pro-Russian constituency in Ukraine has recovered from Russia's aggression. It's still too weak, and it's unlikely that they can get somebody into the second round, which was always the case before with, say, Yanukovych. So if it's Tymoshenko versus Poroshenko, probably Poroshenko would win. Why would he win? Because the problem that populists have everywhere, and this again includes somebody like Trump, is that you either love them or you hate them. There's no in between. Whereas more typically with politicians, you kind of like them on some things, you don't like them on others, and then there are many voters who are simply waiting. They haven't made their minds up, and they won't make their minds up until closer to the election date. And so those kind of undecided voters, or voters who kind of, on balance think he hasn't done everything I wanted, but he's done a few things, are more likely to maybe stick with him. With Tymoshenko, her problem is that she has a hardcore group of voters, but she hasn't been able to, in particular, build her constituency amongst, I would call it, the sort of the middle class, the emerging middle class. She lost the vote in 2010. Why? And that's when she received 3 million fewer votes than Yushchenko in 2004. And those 3 million votes were primarily people who in the first round were kind of urban, middle class, professionals, businessmen, journalists, and such like, who would refuse to vote negatively for her against Yanukovych. Many of those people voted for either Tihipko or Yatsenyuk in round one in 2010. That same group of people today is still sizable, and they, even today, will not vote for her. She hasn't been able to make inroads into that very influential group, and these are people who do have influence. They support NGOs, they go on TV as experts, they work as journalists and such like, or they work in the government or parliament. And she hasn't been able to win that group of people. And that, I think, is going to be her major problem. Because with just a hardcore number of votes, you're not going to be able to have a breakthrough, and you're not going to be able to sort of, do what you did in 2010 even. In 2010, Tymoshenko jumped from 25 to 45% between round one and round two, not because people loved her, but because there was a high number of people voting against Yanukovych. And that was what I was recommending people to do, my friends in Ukraine. You don't have to like the person, but let's stop this guy coming in. Today, it's going to be more difficult for her to, as it were, mobilize a negative voting against Poroshenko, because he isn't that, despite what people say, he's not this, kind of Yanukovych-style politician. I mean, he is not perfect by any means, but to argue that he's sort of, the modern day Yanukovych is ridiculous. Poroshenko has a wild card up his sleeve. He's thinking of holding a referendum on NATO membership on the same day as the elections, presidential elections. And so that would make it also more difficult for people to oppose him at that time. Support for membership of NATO in Ukraine has skyrocketed since Russia's aggression in 2014. Today, polls show anything between 55 to 70% in a referendum would support NATO membership. That's higher than some East European countries received. So, I mean, I think that would work, I think, to boost Poroshenko's potential vote. So, in conclusion, I would say that the likelihood of new faces is very slim, probably unlikely. You have really a very mixed bunch. You have the incumbent President Poroshenko versus 3 or 4 populists, Lyashko, Tymoshenko, Rabinovich, Boyko in particular. 2 are pro-Russian, one's a fake kind of radical, and then you have Tymoshenko, who doesn't, she doesn't bring anything new to the table. That's, again, her problem as well. So she's going to have a difficult time convincing people to back her in round 2. And it's really too late with only a year ahead to go to the elections for that, really, for people to change their minds to a great degree, especially when you have new scandals emerging with Tymoshenko, such as the one now about her unwilling to disclose the source of $780,000 to pay for American consultants in Washington, when her e-declarations to the National Agency for Prevention of Corruption for both 2016 and 2017 only give her a combined income of between about $22,000 and $35,000. So that's a scandal already in Ukraine, and it doesn't show really a commitment to transparency and the fight against corruption if you're kind of doing this kind of thing. Of course, the fault lies on both sides, the American and the Ukrainian. So when we see opinion polls today, which are kind of quite wacky, like the one a few weeks ago showing Lyashko versus Tymoshenko in the second round, we have to be still a bit skeptical because it's still a year to go, and a lot could change. But I'd be surprised if that kind of outcome is going to happen. I think the outcome is going to be a whole range of candidates in round 1 as usual, but round 2, Poroshenko versus Tymoshenko. Thank you.